I still remember the exact shade of late spring sunlight spilling through my kitchen window the day the envelope arrived. It was a warm, honey gold light that made everything on the countertop look softer, almost like it had been painted. My coffee mug sat beside the pile of unopened mail, steam curling upward into the quiet morning. I had no reason to expect anything special, just the usual bills, maybe a flyer or two, but then I saw my name written in looping, familiar handwriting on a pale blush envelope. It was the kind of handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, Emma's. I froze for a moment, fingers resting on the edge of the envelope, my pulse picking up in a way I couldn't quite explain. I slid it open carefully, the paper crisp under my fingertips, and when the card slid out, I caught my breath. The first thing I saw was gold embossing and delicate floral patterns that seemed to catch the light. Then, in the center, the words, "Will you be my maid of honor?" My heart gave a little lurch, like it was trying to push through my ribs. It wasn't just about the title, it was about what it meant. Emma and I had known each other since freshman year of college. We'd been each other's sounding boards through heartbreaks, job changes, apartments that leaked in the winter and smelled of someone else's cooking in the summer. We had shared the kind of late-night talks that strip away every mask and every polite pretense, until all that's left is the bare truth of who you are. So when I read those words, I didn't just see a role in her wedding. I saw years of friendship, of inside jokes, of having been chosen as her person. I laughed out loud, one of those startled, happy laughs that bubble up before you can stop them, and immediately felt tears sting the back of my eyes. I read the words over and over, half afraid they'd change if I looked away. I can't imagine walking down the aisle without you by my side. You've been my rock, my sister, my safe place. Please say yes. I didn't even realize I was already reaching for my phone until I saw Emma's name light up the screen, as if she knew I'd just opened it. Please tell me you said yes already, she blurted out before I could even say hello. Yes, of course, yes. I laughed, wiping at my cheeks. Emma, this means everything to me. I mean it, she said, her voice breaking just enough for me to hear the emotion she was holding back. You've been there for me through so much. I want you right next to me, the whole way. That was the promise we made to each other that morning. Even if we didn't put it into words, I would stand by her, and she would stand by me. And in that moment, I had no reason to doubt it. Over the next few days, I told everyone, my mom, my co-workers, even the barista who always spelled my name wrong on my latte. I bought a little notebook to jot down ideas for her bachelorette party and kept it in my bag so I could add to it whenever inspiration struck. I started pinning color palettes and centerpiece ideas, not because she'd asked me to, but because I wanted everything to be perfect for her. Looking back now, I can still feel the sincerity in my chest, the way I poured myself into the role before it had even officially begun. It was more than just helping her plan a wedding. It was about proving that all those years of friendship meant something, that I could be counted on, not just in the easy seasons, but in the moments that mattered most. I think about that sometimes, how one envelope could hold so much weight, how a few sentences on a card could wrap themselves around your heart and whisper, "You belong here." At the time, I believed it completely. There was no flicker of doubt, no shadow creeping in from the edges. Only light and trust, and the certainty that I would walk into that church or that garden or wherever she chose to say her vows, wearing a dress we picked together, holding her bouquet steady as her hands shook with excitement. I didn't know then that promises can shift without warning, that the ground you've been standing on for years can tilt beneath your feet so quietly you don't notice until you're falling. All I knew was the warmth of her voice on the phone, the way she laughed when I told her I'd already started making lists, the way she said, "I don't know what I'd do without you." I tucked those words into a corner of my mind like a keepsake, and I kept the card. I still have it, actually, though now, when I look at it, it doesn't make me smile. It makes me think about how quickly trust can curdle when the truth starts to rot underneath it. But on that day, in that sunlight, it was pure joy. That envelope felt like a binding contract between us, signed not in ink but in years of shared history. And if you had told me then that just months later I'd be sitting in the last row of her wedding, watching someone else stand in my place, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it. Because back then, betrayal wasn't even a possibility. Back then, I thought friendship like ours was unshakable. From the moment I hung up with Emma that day, my life shifted into a different rhythm, one that orbited entirely around her wedding. I didn't even think twice about it. It was as if accepting the role of maid of honor activated some deeply buried switch in me, turning me into the person who would anticipate needs before they were voiced, solve problems before they became real, and make sacrifices without labeling them as such. The first Saturday after receiving the invitation, I was in my car by a.m., driving to meet Emma at a bridal boutique downtown. The place was one of those airy, softly lit spaces where every mirror is slightly forgiving and the champagne flutes seem to refill themselves. She wanted me there for the first round of dress fittings, even though she'd already brought her mother earlier in the week. "I need your honest eye," she told me, "because my mom loves everything." And so I stood beside her for hours, holding my breath every time she stepped out from behind the curtain in lace or silk, picturing her walking down the aisle in each gown. I took mental notes on how the straps fell, whether the waistline flattered her figure, how the train caught the light. We laughed when one dress swallowed her whole and made her look like she was drowning in tulle. We gasped together when she found the one that made her eyes shine, a gown with delicate beading and a back that dipped just enough to make her smile shyly at her reflection. That day alone I dropped $60 on parking, coffee, and a celebratory lunch afterward, but I didn't care. The memory felt worth more than the receipt. Those early weeks blurred into a cycle of fittings, Pinterest boards, group texts, and weekend errands. There was the day we went to 3 different stationery shops because the exact shade of ivory she wanted for the invitations was too warm at one place and too cold at another. The afternoon we tested half a dozen cake flavors, each more decadent than the last, until we were both sugar drunk and giggling like we were 21 again. I paid for the Uber home so she wouldn't have to think about who was driving, and she promised me we'd balance it out later. I didn't keep track. It wasn't just the fun, glamorous parts either. I was the one who picked up her dry cleaning when the boutique called to say it was ready early. I was the one who stayed up past midnight editing the seating chart she'd scribbled on a legal pad so she could see it laid out neatly on her laptop in the morning. I ran to Target in the rain when the craft store closed early, because she'd decided she needed gold ribbon for the wedding favors that night. Somewhere in the middle of all that, my own life started shifting around to make space for hers. I turned down overtime at work more than once because there was a dress fitting or a tasting I couldn't miss. I said no to a weekend trip with friends because it overlapped with her bridal shower planning meeting. My bank account felt the slow bleed of gas, coffee, lunches, and little treats for her that I convinced myself she'd remember: a monogrammed hanger for her gown, a set of pearl hairpins I spotted on sale. But I didn't mind. If anything, I felt a strange satisfaction in it. Like each dollar spent and each hour given was proof of my loyalty, tangible evidence that I deserved to be standing beside her when she said I do. I thought that's how this worked. You invest yourself fully, and it's reciprocated in trust, in gratitude, in the shared joy of seeing it all come together. There were late nights when she'd call, frazzled about something as small as the color of the table linens or as big as her fianki's guest list ballooning without warning. I'd sit on the floor of my apartment, laptop open, researching solutions while she vented. "You're a lifesaver," she'd sigh when we found a compromise, and I'd feel that warm glow again, the one that made every sacrifice seem like nothing at all. Her maid of honor dress for me was another small saga. She wanted something elegant but not flashy, something that would complement her gown without drawing attention. I spent weekends combing through department stores and online boutiques, texting her mirror selfies for approval. When she finally settled on a floor-length chiffon dress in a muted rose, it was more than I'd budgeted for, but I swiped my card without hesitation. It was for Emma. That was reason enough. Looking back now, I can see how easily I justified shifting my life around hers. I told myself it was temporary, just until the wedding. I told myself she would have done the same for me. I told myself this was the natural rhythm of friendship in moments that matter. What I didn't realize then, what I couldn't have, was how these small, steady sacrifices would make the silence that came later so much louder. How every errand run, every late night call answered, every dollar spent without thought would sharpen the sting when I found out it had all been replaced, quietly and without warning. But in those months, I didn't question a thing. I was too busy making sure the flowers matched the centerpieces, that the playlist for the reception flowed without awkward gaps, that Emma's stress stayed low enough for her to enjoy her own engagement. I thought I was building something unshakable between us. I didn't know I was laying the groundwork for the kind of heartbreak you only feel when betrayal comes wearing a familiar face. It didn't happen all at once. If it had, I think I would have noticed the way you notice a slammed door or a sudden change in weather. But this was slower, quieter, like a shadow stretching across the floor as the sun shifts in the sky. You don't realize how far it's crept until you're already standing in the dark. The first sign was small enough that I brushed it off. Emma had texted about a menu tasting scheduled for the following weekend. "I'll send you the details later," she'd said, adding a little heart emoji the way she always did. But the details never came. I assumed she got busy. When I finally asked 2 days later, she replied, "Oh, we moved it up. Did it yesterday with my mom and Anna, her cousin." I told myself it made sense. Maybe it was a last-minute opportunity. Maybe she didn't want to bother me on short notice. I didn't like the way my stomach tightened reading it, but I smoothed it over with logic. I'd been there for every other step so far. Missing one tasting wasn't the end of the world. Then it was a dress fitting. I had the date circled in my calendar, even swapped shifts at work to make sure I'd be free. The morning of, I sent her a quick "can't wait to see you later" text. She replied with, "Oh, I forgot to tell you we changed it to last week." The alterations were running ahead of schedule. I stared at the screen, rereading it. No apology. Just a fact dropped into my lap like it didn't matter. Little things started piling up after that. I'd open Instagram and see photos from brunches or planning sessions I hadn't known about. I'd scroll past a shot of her and the other bridesmaids, all holding swatches of fabric and smiling, and feel that same twist in my chest. I hadn't been invited to that one either. Her messages shifted too. Where she used to text long strings of updates, peppered with jokes and late-night memes, now she sent short, efficient notes. "Can you check the RSVP list? Need your mailing address again." Gone was the easy chatter that used to flow between us, replaced by something that felt managerial, like I was a coworker, not her maid of honor and certainly not her best friend. I told myself she was stressed. Weddings are stressful. People get tunnel vision. Maybe she was leaning more on her family now that the big day was getting closer. That was natural, wasn't it? But deep down, there was this small, stubborn ache I couldn't quite reason away. Because it wasn't just that I was being left out of small errands, it was that I wasn't even being told they were happening. The breaking point for my denial came during what should have been a simple group text. Emma sent a message to the bridesmaid chat. "Hey girls, bachelorette party planning meeting at my place Friday night. Bye Ob." I typed back immediately. "Perfect. I'll bring the playlists we talked about." No reply from Emma. Instead, 5 minutes later, another bridesmaid chimed in. "Oh, didn't you get the update? We moved it to last Friday so her sister could join." Sorry. That sorry felt like a stone in my throat. I sat there staring at the chat, watching the others exchange inside jokes about the party that had already happened, feeling more like an outsider than I had in years. I told myself I should just call her, ask what was going on. But every time I thought about dialing her number, a knot tightened in my stomach. I didn't want to sound needy. I didn't want to sound like I was making it all about me. After all, this was her wedding. But the space between us was growing, and I could feel it in ways I couldn't always name. She didn't send me random memes anymore. She didn't ask about my day. She didn't check in the way she used to, and I started to realize I was the only one initiating conversations at all. One night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at the spreadsheet where I'd been tracking our SVP counts and vendor deposits. I'd started this file the week she asked me to be her maid of honor, proud of myself for being so organized. Now it felt like I was holding a project I'd been quietly fired from, still showing up to do work no one had asked me for. The thing is, you don't expect to have to fight for your place in a friendship you've already earned. You think that once someone chooses you for something as intimate as standing beside them on their wedding day, the choice is solid, final, unshakable. But I was beginning to sense in the clipped messages, the skipped invitations, the gatherings I learned about only after they'd happened that my place wasn't as secure as I'd believed. And yet, I kept telling myself to ignore it, to give her grace, to stay quiet, because the alternative, asking her outright if something was wrong, felt too dangerous. What if she said yes? What if she told me the thing I was starting to fear? So I stayed in my lane, kept my head down, and kept showing up in whatever ways I could. But the more I tried to ignore the signs, the clearer they became. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice I didn't want to listen to kept whispering, "Something is changing, and you might not like where it's headed." It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of one of those workdays where your brain is already too full to process anything extra. I'd been sitting at my desk, half listening to a meeting on mute, clicking through emails while sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. My phone buzzed against the desk, a notification from Instagram. Normally, I would have ignored it until later, but the preview caught my eye, a tag from Emma's account. Curious, I clicked. It was a photo from what looked like a bridal party, fitting the kind where all the bridesmaids stand together, lined up like a soft-colored gradient of chiffon and satin, smiling into the mirror. Emma was in the middle, glowing, holding her phone for the group shot. On either side of her were faces I recognized: her sister, two college friends. But standing in the spot directly beside her, the one I had always assumed would be mine on the wedding day, was a woman I had never seen before. The caption read, "Couldn't have picked a more perfect maid of honor, so blessed to have these amazing ladies by my side." I blinked at the screen, certain I was reading it wrong. I read it again, "Maid of honor." My chest tightened. At first, my brain scrambled to make sense of it. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe she meant maid of honor in the casual sense, the way you call someone your right-hand person without meaning it officially. Maybe she was just being generous with titles. But the more I stared, the more the details screamed otherwise. The way this new woman stood with her hand looped through Emma's arm, the way she was angled slightly forward like she'd been positioned deliberately, the way Emma's sister and the others were turned toward her in the photo. I scrolled through the rest of the post. There were more pictures, close-ups of the two of them laughing, shots of her holding Emma's veil while the others clapped, even a boomerang of them clinking champagne glasses with the words "to the Mo" in glittery script across the screen. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been told. Not a text, not a call, not even a casual mention in passing. No explanation for why the stranger was now holding the place I had been promised months ago, the role I had already been living, sacrificing for, planning around. I felt heat rising in my face, the kind that comes when humiliation hits before the anger does. Because this wasn't just about the title. It was about everything that had come before: the months of planning, the errands, the late-night calls, the money spent without hesitation. All of it had been under the assumption that I was the person she wanted by her side. And now, I was finding out in the same way the rest of the internet was, as a spectator. I sat there for a long time, phone in hand, my meeting still droning on in the background, words blurring into static. Part of me wanted to text her immediately, demand an explanation. Another part, the louder one, didn't trust my voice not to crack or my words not to betray how deeply it hurt. So I did nothing. That evening, I tried to distract myself with chores, Netflix, anything. But every time I picked up my phone, the photos were still there, racking up likes and comments. "You two are going to be such a dream team. So happy for you. Emma, she's perfect for the role." And each heart emoji, each exclamation point, felt like a tiny shove, pushing me further out of a space I thought I belonged in. I replayed the last few weeks in my mind, all those small signs I'd brushed aside. The tastings I wasn't invited to, the fittings that happened without me, the group chats that kept planning things I only heard about after the fact. It had all been leading here to this quiet replacement, done so neatly I almost had to admire the precision. But what struck me the hardest was the silence. She hadn't given me the courtesy of telling me herself. No awkward coffee meetup to break the news gently. No, "this has been a tough decision" speech. Just omission. Like I could be edited out of the story without anyone noticing. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone face down on the nightstand because I couldn't bear to see another notification from that post. I kept thinking about the day I got her invitation, about how I'd cried and told her it meant everything to me. I'd believed it was a shared promise, and now, the promise felt like something she'd tossed aside without a second thought. I don't know how long I stayed there, motionless, my chest heavy with the kind of ache that doesn't have an immediate outlet. Eventually, my phone buzzed again, a message from one of the other bridesmaids. "Hey, I know you probably saw Emma's post. I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to find out that way." That sorry was the final nail. It confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a slip of wording or a mix-up in a caption. This was deliberate. She had replaced me, and everyone else already knew. When I finally fell asleep, it was with a cold, hollow feeling in my chest. Not the sharp stab of fresh betrayal, but the heavy weight of knowing I had been erased, not loudly, but with the kind of quiet finality you can't come back from. And yet, even in that heaviness, there was the faintest ember of something else. A question barely formed, sitting just beneath the grief. Do I still go? It was a thought that would keep me company for the next few days, growing sharper, more defined, until it became the decision that set everything else in motion. For days after seeing that post, I moved through my life like I was wearing someone else's skin. Everything felt slightly off, like the colors had shifted a half shade darker and the air was just a little harder to breathe. I went to work, answered emails, paid bills, all the ordinary things, but every time I was alone, my mind circled back to the same question. Do I still go? The logical part of me was clear. Why should I? Why should I spend another ounce of energy, another second of my time, on a day that no longer had a place for me? The title wasn't just ceremonial, it had been a position of trust, intimacy, and visible presence. And she had given it to someone else without a word. Showing up now would be like stepping onto a stage where my lines had been cut, my costume given to another actor, and being told to watch the performance from the back row. But logic has a way of faltering when it collides with history. Emma and I had been friends for over a decade. I'd been there through her first real breakup, the job she thought would be her dream but turned into a nightmare, the family crisis that left her calling me at a m just to hear someone's voice. We'd shared countless small joys, birthdays, late-night pancakes at the all-night diner, summer road trips with the windows down. Walking away from her wedding entirely felt like erasing all of that in one swift motion. And there was another truth I didn't like admitting to myself. Part of me still wanted to see her get married. Even if I was no longer by her side, I had been there for so much of the lead up. I'd heard the story of how he proposed, seen the way her face softened when she talked about him, helped pick the linens and flowers that would fill that day. The idea of not seeing the final result of cutting myself out entirely felt like tearing out the last page of a book I'd been reading for years. Still, every time I imagined walking into that venue, I could already feel the stares. People would know. They'd seen the post. They'd read the caption. They'd wonder why I was there at all. Some might pity me. Others might simply be curious, their eyes flicking between me and the new maid of honor, comparing us in ways I didn't want to imagine. One night, about a week before the wedding, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, staring at the invitation I'd kept pinned to my fridge for months. The gold script that had once made me smile now seemed to glare back at me, like a relic from another time. I took it down and set it on the table, tracing my finger over my name. That's when the thought came, sharp and uninvited. Maybe showing up is its own kind of answer. If I didn't go, the absence would speak for me, but only in whispers. People might assume I was too hurt, too bitter, or simply uninterested. They might never know what had really happened, that I had been replaced without warning, without explanation. But if I went, if I was there in the room, it would be impossible to erase me completely. I would be a living reminder, even if I sat quietly at the back. I wrestled with it for days, the debate looping in my head. 1 hour I was certain I'd stay home, spare myself the humiliation. The next, I was equally sure that my presence, even if distant, was a way of reclaiming something. Not the role I'd lost, but my own agency in the story. The tipping point came from an unexpected place. My mother, who had always liked Emma but wasn't deeply involved in our friendship, called to check in. She asked how the wedding planning was going, and I told her carefully that I wasn't in the wedding party anymore. She paused for a long moment, then said, "Well, that's disappointing. But it's still a milestone for someone you once cared about deeply. If you can go without losing yourself, maybe you should. Not for her, for you." That night, I stood in front of my closet, looking at the dress I'd originally bought for the ceremony. It was the muted rose chiffon Emma had picked, the one I'd paid for without hesitation. Now it felt wrong to wear something she'd chosen for me when I was no longer part of the vision she'd had. I slid it back on the hanger and reached for a simple navy dress instead, elegant, understated, and entirely mine. If I was going to be there, I would go as myself, not as the ghost of a role I no longer held. I pictured it in my mind, arriving quietly, finding a seat in the last row, and watching the ceremony unfold. I wouldn't make a scene. I wouldn't confront her. My being there wouldn't be about her approval or anyone else's. It would be about my own choice to witness the day on my terms. By the time I zipped the garment bag closed, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The decision was made. I would go. Not because I'd been invited into the new circle she'd drawn, but because I refused to let her push me out of the picture entirely. In the days that followed, I kept my plan to myself. I arved yes without comment. I didn't reach out to Emma. I didn't comment on her posts or try to bridge the distance that had opened between us. The space between us was hers to close if she wanted to, and she hadn't. Still, a part of me wondered what would happen when she saw me there. Would there be a flicker of guilt, surprise, or would she simply pretend not to notice, as if I were just another guest blending into the crowd? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew I was ready to find out. The morning of the wedding arrived colder than I'd expected for the season, the kind of crisp air that bites your cheeks and makes your breath visible in short bursts. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror longer than necessary, curling and uncurling the same section of hair just to give my hands something to do. The navy dress hung on the back of the door, its fabric catching the light in a way that made it look almost steely. I'd chosen it deliberately. It wasn't meant to blend into bridesmaid pastels, but it also wasn't loud enough to shout for attention. It was armor disguised as elegance. I applied my makeup slowly, focusing on precision. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel composed. If I was going to walk into that room and face the woman who had taken my place and the bride who had let it happen, I needed to look like I belonged anywhere I chose to stand. The drive to the venue was quiet, the low hum of the tires on the road blending with the muted playlist I'd put on to steady my nerves. I'd been to this location before, months earlier, during one of the planning visits with Emma. Back then, we'd walked through the garden, imagining the arch draped in flowers, the chairs in perfect rows, the aisle runner in just the right shade of cream. I remembered her laughing, saying she could already see me standing to her left, bouquet in hand. That memory hit like a stone as I pulled into the parking lot. The place looked exactly as we'd envisioned, only now, the version of the day we'd built together was happening without me. I stepped out of the car, pulling my coat tighter around me. Guests were trickling toward the entrance, their voices rising and falling in cheerful bursts. I recognized a few faces, though most were friends of Emma's extended family or colleagues I'd met only once. A few people glanced my way, their expressions flickering with recognition before settling into polite smiles. I wondered how many of them already knew, how many had read the caption under that Instagram post. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with lilies and something sugary from the dessert table. Soft music floated through the space, the kind that makes everything feel like it's moving in slow motion. I followed the subtle flow of guests toward the main hall, keeping my pace even, my eyes forward. That's when I saw her. She was standing near the front, surrounded by a small cluster of bridesmaids, her hand curled protectively around the bouquet I had once imagined holding. The dress she wore was similar to the one I'd originally bought, the muted rose chiffon, but tailored to fit her perfectly. Her hair was styled in loose waves that caught the light every time she moved. She was laughing at something Emma had just said, leaning in like they'd shared 1,000 moments before this one. Emma stood beside her, radiant in her gown, one hand resting lightly on her new maid of honor's arm. When she looked at her, it was with a warmth I recognized, the same warmth she used to direct at me during those long nights of planning. The same expression she'd worn when we'd first talked about her wedding years ago. I felt a physical pull in my chest, an instinct to look away, but I didn't. I let myself see it, the replacement in its full, living form. She wasn't just a name in a caption or a stranger in a photograph anymore. She was here, in the flesh, occupying a space that had once been mine. I kept moving, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor. As I approached the seating area, I caught the new maid of honor's gaze for the briefest moment. Her smile faltered, just slightly, as if she'd realized who I was. Maybe she'd been warned. Maybe she'd pieced it together herself. Either way, she didn't hold my eyes for long. She turned back to Emma almost immediately, her expression sliding back into its perfect composure. I found a seat in the middle of the last row, the vantage point I'd chosen in my mind weeks ago. From here, I could see everything without being seen too much. The aisle stretched out before me like a literal distance marker between where I sat and where I had once expected to stand. As the minutes passed, more guests filled in around me. I exchanged polite nods, murmured greetings, and kept my posture straight. My hands rested loosely in my lap, but I could feel the faint tremor in them. The chatter in the room rose and fell, occasionally punctuated by laughter or the click of a camera shutter. Then I heard her voice. Emma's laugh carried over the crowd, light and familiar, wrapping itself around the edges of my memory before settling like a weight in my chest. I glanced up just in time to see her and the new maid of honor moving toward the side room where the bridal party would wait for the ceremony to start. For a split second, Emma's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on me. It was quick, a flicker of recognition, a brief tightening of her mouth, and then she was gone, turning back to the conversation in front of her. No wave, no smile, no acknowledgement beyond that split second. I sat back in my chair, the warmth from the heater overhead doing nothing to cut the chill that had settled inside me. I told myself this was what I'd expected, that I hadn't come here looking for reconciliation or even civility. But the truth was, some small, stubborn part of me had hoped for something. Instead, I had the reality, the woman in the muted rose dress holding my bouquet, standing where I had once been promised I would stand, and the bride who had chosen her both moving through the day as if I had never been part of the picture at all. The ceremony hadn't even started yet, and already the distance between who we used to be and who we were now felt immeasurable. The last row had always seemed like a safe choice in theory. From back here, you could disappear into the crowd, dissolve into anonymity, and let the day unfold without being pulled into its orbit. But as I settled into the seat, smoothing my dress over my knees, I realized that the last row wasn't a shield, it was a vantage point. It gave me the perfect view of everything, but it also made me visible in a way I hadn't anticipated. From the moment I sat down, I could feel it, the glances. They came in waves, quick, darting looks that people thought they were disguising, but weren't. A couple I vaguely knew from Emma's extended friend circle entered the room, spotted me, and exchanged one of those micro-expressions that only last a heartbeat. It wasn't surprise, more like quiet confirmation, as if they'd already heard the story, whatever version of it had been passed around. I kept my posture straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap, a small, polite smile fixed in place. The kind of expression you wear when you want to look unbothered, even if your chest feels like someone's pressing a hand against it. My eyes wandered over the decorations, the delicate floral arrangements, the candlelit aisle, the soft ivory draping, and I remembered the conversations where those details had been born. Sitting on Emma's couch with fabric swatches spread across the coffee table, both of us in sweatpants, debating candle heights like it was a matter of state security. That memory burned hotter than the stairs. As more guests filled the seats around me, the noise level rose. Laughter mingled with the faint sound of the string quartet warming up near the front. Every now and then, I'd catch fragments of conversation, compliments on the flowers, questions about the reception menu, but occasionally, there was a slip, a whisper with a different weight. "That's her, right?" One voice murmured behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew. "Yeah, I think so." Shame though. The rest of the sentence was swallowed by the swell of music. I focused on the runner in front of me, the subtle texture in the fabric. Inhale, exhale. This was what I'd chosen to be here, to see it, to hold my ground. I reminded myself that pity was just another form of attention, and attention wasn't why I'd come. But it was impossible not to feel the tension in the air whenever someone walked past my row on their way to a seat closer to the front. They'd glance down, register me, and their expressions would shift, sometimes softening, sometimes tightening into something unreadable. I wondered which was worse, being pitied or being silently judged. The bridal party began to filter in from a side door, gathering near the archway where the ceremony would begin. I spotted the new maid of honor almost instantly. She stood in the center of the group, holding Emma's bouquet like it was an extension of herself. She looked confident, perfectly composed, and completely at ease in her role. The other bridesmaids hovered around her, adjusting their dresses, chatting, laughing. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Their body language was enough. This was her team now. Emma appeared a moment later, escorted by her father, her dress flowing behind her like a river of ivory. Even from this distance, I could see the way her face lit up as she looked ahead toward the aisle. The guests in the first few rows turned, their expressions soft and admiring. From where I sat, the moment felt almost surreal, like I was watching a film of someone else's life, one I had once been cast in, but was now only allowed to view from the cheap seats. I told myself to focus on the bigger picture, to appreciate the beauty of the ceremony as a whole, but my eyes kept returning to the dynamic between Emma and the new maid of honor. The little glances they shared, the quiet exchanges, the way she adjusted Emma's train with practiced hands before stepping back into position. Those were my motions, my muscle memory, transferred to someone else without warning. A shift in the room's energy pulled my attention toward the side, Two women I recognized from Emma's college days were whispering to each other while looking in my direction. One of them caught my eye, her face flushing before she turned back to her friend. I could almost hear the unspoken question hanging between them. Why is she here? The music shifted to a softer, more deliberate melody, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Guests leaned forward slightly, conversations tapering off. I adjusted in my seat, straightening my spine, forcing my shoulders back. If I was going to sit here and feel every eye on me, I'd meet them head on. I didn't know it yet, but this was the moment when my quiet presence began to take on a life of its own. People saw me, noted where I was sitting, and whether they pitied me or not, they were aware of the contrast. The absence in the bridal lineup wasn't invisible, and maybe, just maybe, that mattered more than I realized. As Emma took her first steps down the aisle, the room collectively inhaled. All eyes were on her, as they should have been, but from my seat in the last row, I noticed something else, a flicker from the corner of the room. The photographer, moving with quiet precision, scanning the crowd for moments beyond the obvious. His lens passed over me once, then came back, pausing just a beat too long before moving on again. I didn't know why, but the look in his eyes, that slight narrowing, that almost imperceptible recognition, made something shift in my chest. For the first time that day, I wondered if sitting in the last row might not be the end of my story here. Maybe it was the start of something else entirely. From the last row, you have a kind of panoramic view that no one else gets. You see not just the focal point, the bride, the groom, the altar, but every detail in the periphery. The way people lean toward each other to whisper, the fidgeting hands, the sideways glances when something unexpected happens. It's a strange vantage point, one that gives you the whole picture while still making you feel like you're not part of it. As Emma reached the front of the aisle and the music softened to that slow, deliberate cadence that signals the vows are near, I let my gaze settle on her face. She was beautiful, of course she was, but it was the kind of beauty that felt sealed off from me now, like a painting in a museum. I could admire it, but it no longer had any personal connection to my own life. Beside her, the new maid of honor was flawless. Every movement was smooth, deliberate, placing Emma's bouquet just so, adjusting the train of her dress with the kind of timing that comes from rehearsals I'd never been invited to. She smiled when she was supposed to, leaned in to whisper something to Emma that made them both laugh softly. Watching them together was like watching a performance where I'd once had a starring role, only to find my name missing from the program. The officiant began speaking, his voice warm and measured, and the room seemed to fold in around the couple. Everyone's attention was drawn forward. Everyone's but mine. I found my eyes wandering again to the front row where Emma's family sat, to the groom's side where a few unfamiliar faces watched with polite interest, to the photographer moving like a shadow between the aisles. He was careful, almost invisible in his work, but I noticed the way his lens lingered on moments other people might not think to capture, a tear sliding down Emma's mother's cheek, the groom's hand tightening slightly as he took Emma's. At one point, his camera swept over the guests, and for the second time that day, it paused on me, just a beat longer than necessary. I didn't know what he saw, maybe just the contrast of my navy dress among the sea of pastel, maybe the stillness I'd been holding like a shield since I sat down, but there was something in his expression, the faintest furrow of curiosity, that made my skin prickle. I looked away, fixing my eyes on the couple again, just as they began their vows. Emma's voice carried clearly to the back of the room. I recognized some of the phrases. She'd shared early drafts of these with me months ago, back when we'd stayed up late on her couch trying to make them sound personal but not too cheesy. Now, hearing them spoken aloud, I felt the strangeness of being in the audience for something I had helped shape, but was no longer connected to. When the groom spoke his vows, I realized I didn't know a single word of them. Emma must have helped him, or maybe they'd written them together, but I hadn't been part of those conversations. That thought hit me harder than I expected. The wedding wasn't just happening without me physically beside her, it had been happening without me for a long time before today. Applause rippled through the room as they exchanged rings. I clapped with everyone else, my hands moving automatically, but the sound felt hollow in my ears. From the corner of my vision, I saw the new maid of honor step forward to adjust Emma's veil, her fingers deft and certain. It was a small act, but it landed like a blow. That had been my job, not just the physical movement, but the instinct, the awareness of when she needed something before she even asked. The officiant pronounced them married, and the room erupted into cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, grinning, hands clasped tightly. Guests leaned in to catch photos on their phones, and the bridal party followed behind them, each pair smiling as they made their way out. When the new maid of honor passed my row, her gaze flicked toward me again, quick and unreadable. If there was acknowledgement there, it was buried under layers of composure. As the last of the procession disappeared into the reception area, the guests began to stand, stretching, gathering their things. A few people glanced back toward the last row as they moved toward the exit, and I could feel the same question radiating off them that I'd felt earlier. Why is she here? I held my head high, offering small, polite smiles, making sure I didn't shrink under the weight of their curiosity. It was strange. I had expected to feel invisible here, but invisibility wasn't what was happening. I was being seen, just not spoken to. A silent presence that people didn't quite know how to place. And for reasons I couldn't fully name yet, that fact began to feel important. As I followed the stream of guests out toward the reception hall, I caught sight of the photographer again. He was leaning against the wall near the doorway, checking the back of his camera. When he noticed me looking, he didn't glance away like most people did. He held my gaze for a moment, then gave the smallest nod before slipping back into the crowd. I didn't know it yet, but that nod was the first thread in a chain of events that would change the rest of the day and the way people remembered it entirely. The reception hall was already buzzing when I stepped through the doors. The music was louder here, the kind that fills every corner and makes conversation feel private despite the crowd. People moved in loose clusters, some already at their tables, others circling the buffet, a few gathered near the bar with champagne flutes in hand. I paused just inside the threshold, taking in the scene, the mix of light and movement, the way the air felt warmer from so many bodies in one space. From my position at the entrance, I had a direct view of the head table. It was elevated slightly, draped in the same ivory fabric I'd once helped pick out, and positioned so the bride and groom sat in the center with their wedding party fanned out on either side. I found her instantly, the new maid of honor, sitting in the seat that should have been mine. The muted rose dress caught the glow from the overhead lights, making her stand out even among the matching gowns. She was leaning in toward Emma, their heads close, sharing a laugh over something I couldn't hear. I might have looked away quickly if not for the movement at the far edge of the room, a figure weaving between tables with a practiced ease, his camera strap slung diagonally across his chest. The photographer. Even in the shifting crowd, he had that unmistakable purposeful glide of someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he wanted to capture. I don't know if he noticed me first, or if I found him in the crowd, but the moment our eyes met, I felt it. He stopped mid-step, just for a second, not long enough for anyone else to register it, but long enough for me to feel the pause. His expression didn't change much, but his focus sharpened, like a lens clicking into place. He adjusted the camera in his hands, raised it slightly, then lowered it again without taking a shot. It wasn't hesitation. It was assessment. Like he was deciding whether what he saw was worth breaking from whatever schedule he'd been given. I moved further into the room, my heels making a muted sound against the polished floor, and found a spot near the edge of the crowd where I could see without being boxed in. I busied myself with the usual rituals, setting my coat over the back of my chair, checking my phone even though there were no new messages, sipping water from the glass at my place setting. All the while I could feel the occasional sweep of his gaze in my direction. It wasn't invasive. If anything, it felt like he was taking notes no one else was writing. And maybe that was what caught my attention most, the fact that in a room overflowing with curated moments, he seemed interested in something unplanned. The formalities began, the first toast, delivered by the groom's best man. Polite laughter at a slightly too long story. The polite scraping of forks against plates as salads were served. I clapped and smiled in all the right places, but my focus kept drifting. I'd catch sight of the photographer slipping between tables, crouching slightly to capture a guest's reaction, or angling himself so the fairy lights in the background framed the couple just right. He moved like someone who could see the narrative threads no one else was paying attention to. At one point, he passed close to my table, close enough that I caught the faint scent of his cologne, something clean and subtle. He didn't look directly at me, but the corner of his mouth lifted, almost imperceptibly, as though we shared some private joke neither of us had voiced. Then he was gone again, swallowed up by the rhythm of his work. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural attentiveness of a professional making sure every guest felt included in the album. But I knew that wasn't true. His lens had lingered on me more than once during the ceremony. He had noticed where I was sitting. And now, here in the reception, he seemed to be circling back. The real moment came about halfway through the speeches. Emma's father was at the microphone, telling a story from her childhood that had the whole room laughing. I laughed too, though mine was softer, more contained. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again standing just beyond the arc of the head table's light, his camera raised. But this time, he wasn't aiming at the bride and groom. He was aiming at me. It was instinct, I think, that made me hold his gaze instead of looking away. If he was going to photograph me, I wanted to decide how I'd be seen. So I straightened my shoulders, softened my expression into something calm but unreadable, and let the moment stretch. I could hear the faint click of the shutter once, twice, and then he lowered the camera, still looking at me. There was no smile this time. Just a quiet acknowledgement, a slight dip of his head, before he turned and moved toward the far side of the room. But something in that exchange lingered, as if we'd both understood it was more than a snapshot. It was a choice. I didn't know yet why he'd made it, or what he saw worth capturing in a woman sitting alone in the last row during the ceremony, now keeping to herself at a table half hidden in the corner of the reception. But I knew that whatever it was, it had been noticed. And in a day where I had been deliberately erased from the official narrative, the knowledge that one person was still quietly documenting my presence felt like the first thread of something I couldn't quite name. As the applause for the speech swelled, I clapped along with everyone else, my eyes flicking toward where I'd last seen him. He was gone again, folded back into the flow of the evening. But I had the strange feeling that I hadn't seen the last of him. And I was right. Dinner was over, the plates cleared with the quiet efficiency of the catering staff, and the mood in the room had shifted from polite formality to that comfortable looseness that comes after a good meal and a few glasses of wine. People were talking more freely, laughter was rising in pockets around the tables, and the music had been turned up just enough to coax the first brave guests onto the dance floor. I'd settled into a rhythm of watching from my corner table, participating just enough to avoid drawing questions but staying far enough on the margins to feel insulated from the center of things. It was in this in-between space, neither fully in the celebration nor entirely outside it, that I saw him again. The photographer. He was across the room, camera hanging from his neck now instead of in his hands, scanning the crowd like someone mentally mapping the next set of shots. Our eyes met briefly, and I felt the now familiar jolt of recognition. This time, he didn't look away. He started walking toward me, weaving through the tables with that same purposeful stride I'd noticed earlier. My first instinct was to glance behind me, to see if he was heading for someone else, but there was no one in my immediate orbit. He was coming straight toward me. When he reached my table, he leaned down just enough so I could hear him over the music. "Can you come here for a moment?" It wasn't a question in the tentative sense, more of a request delivered with quiet certainty, like he already knew I'd say yes. For a second, I hesitated, scanning his face for any hint of what this was about. His expression was neutral, but there was a steadiness in his eyes, the kind that makes you feel like stepping into their focus will matter in ways you can't quite predict. I stood, smoothing my dress, feeling a ripple of curiosity and, if I'm honest, a thread of apprehension run through me. A few people at nearby tables glanced over, their expressions shifting almost imperceptibly as they registered the sight of me following the photographer toward the front of the room. He led me along the edge of the dance floor, past clusters of guests swaying in time to the music, until we reached a small open space just to the side of the head table. It was close enough that the bride and groom, and by extension, the entire wedding party, could see us, but far enough that we weren't directly in the spotlight. "Stand here," he said quietly, gesturing to a spot where the light fell just right. I stepped into place, my pulse quickening. I was acutely aware of how visible I was now, how the room's energy seemed to shift ever so slightly toward this unexpected scene. Emma noticed us first. I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes as she turned her head, the way her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered it. The new maid of honor followed her gaze, and for a moment, the two of them looked at me in unison, not hostile, exactly, but with a kind of sharpened awareness. The photographer lifted his camera. "Look at me," he said, his voice calm but firm. I did. And in that moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade, the music and chatter receding into a muted hum. All I could see was the lens, and behind it, the steady focus of someone who had chosen to turn this into a moment worth capturing. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Whatever was in my face, the history, the hurt, the quiet resolve would be there whether I tried to control it or not. The shutter clicked. Once, twice, 3 times. Between each shot, he adjusted slightly, changing his angle, framing me against different parts of the background. In one, I knew he'd caught Emma and the new maid of honor just over my shoulder. In another, the bouquet was visible in the corner of the frame, held by someone else but tethered to me by context alone. I could feel eyes on me from every direction now. Some guests were whispering, others simply watched, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected intrusion of someone from the last row into the photographer's chosen frame. I stood still, letting the moment stretch, feeling the weight of being seen in a way I hadn't been all day. When he lowered the camera, there was no grand pronouncement, no explanation, just that same small nod I'd seen before, as if to say, that's all I needed. Then he stepped back, slinging the camera over his shoulder and moving toward the next cluster of guests, leaving me in the space he'd pulled me into. I didn't move immediately. I could feel the shift in the room, subtle, but unmistakable. People had seen it. Emma had seen it. And for the first time since the ceremony began, I wasn't just the quiet figure in the last row. I was part of the visual record of the day, woven into it in a way no seating chart or title could erase. As I made my way back to my table, the new maid of honor's gaze followed me, her expression unreadable. Emma, for her part, avoided looking directly at me, turning instead to speak to someone at the far end of the head table. But the tightness in her shoulders told me she'd felt the disruption, however small it might have seemed to anyone else. I sat down again, my heart still beating faster than normal, and took a sip of water. I didn't know yet what the photos would look like, or if they'd ever make it into the final album. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The moment had happened, in full view of everyone who mattered. And sometimes a single moment is all it takes to change the way a story gets remembered. When I sat back down at my table, the sound of the shutter still seemed to echo faintly in my ears, even over the music and the clinking of glasses. It was absurd, really just a few photographs in the middle of a long wedding reception. Nothing in the grand scheme of the day. And yet, there was something about the way it had happened, the deliberate choice of it, that I knew had altered the chemistry of the room. From my seat, I could see little changes in body language, tiny adjustments that most people wouldn't notice if they weren't looking for them. The heads at the head table leaned toward each other a fraction more, voices dropping to lower tones. Guests at nearby tables whispered behind raised hands. Even the laughter seemed to shift in timbre, becoming lighter in some corners and sharper in others. I sipped my water and kept my posture relaxed, as if being pulled into that moment with the photographer had been the most natural thing in the world. But inside, there was a hum not of anxiety, but of awareness. I had been placed back into the visual memory of this day in a way no one could easily remove. Whether the photos made the final cut or not didn't matter right now. The people in this room had seen it happen. That was enough. The band transitioned into a slower song, the kind meant to coax more guests onto the dance floor. I watched as couples drifted forward, some swaying awkwardly, others moving with the ease of long familiarity. The photographer was out there too, camera in hand again, gliding among them like a quiet observer. He caught the groom spinning Emma with a practiced twirl, then shifted his focus to a laughing group near the back. But every so often, I'd feel his gaze sweep back in my direction, as if checking to see if I was still in place, still holding my ground. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A woman at the next table, someone I vaguely remembered from Emma's college years, leaned toward her companion and murmured something, her eyes flicking briefly toward me. He followed her gaze, then glanced back at the head table, his brow furrowing in thought. I didn't need to hear the words to know the seed had been planted. Who is she to the photographer? Why did he choose her? When the song ended, the MC took the microphone to announce that the photographer wanted to gather a few special shots before the cake cutting. My stomach tightened, though I told myself I was being irrational. There was no reason to think I'd be included again. But then I saw him scanning the room, his eyes catching mine almost immediately. Without hesitation, he gestured subtly toward a spot near the dance floor. I could have ignored it. I could have stayed seated, pretending not to understand. But the truth was, some stubborn part of me wanted to see where this would lead. So I rose, feeling the quiet weight of a dozen glances as I crossed the room. The photographer met me halfway, giving a small approving nod before positioning me just off-center from the main group he was arranging. The group shot included members of both families, a few close friends, and to my surprise the entire bridal party. As they filed into place, the new maid of honor took her spot beside Emma, her eyes darting toward me for the briefest moment. I didn't look away. If anything, I let the contact linger just long enough to make it clear that my presence here was intentional, not accidental. When everyone was in position, the photographer adjusted his angle, framing the shot so that I was unmistakably part of it, not in the shadows, not on the fringes, but visible enough to be recognized by anyone who knew the history. I stood with the same calm, unreadable expression I'd worn earlier, letting the weight of the moment speak for itself. The shutter clicked in a steady rhythm. Between shots, the photographer gave small instructions: chin up, eyes here, hold that, but he never once moved me further to the side. I stayed exactly where he'd placed me, and with each click, I could feel the narrative of the day bending, just slightly, to make space for me again. When it was over, there was a beat of silence before the group dispersed, a ripple of unspoken thoughts passing through those closest to the center. Some smiled politely as they moved away, others avoided eye contact altogether. Emma remained by the head table, talking to someone with exaggerated focus, but I caught the flicker of her eyes in my direction more than once. Back at my seat, I noticed a change in how people approached me. A few guests I hadn't spoken to all evening now stopped to say hello, their tones warm but tinged with curiosity. One even mentioned casually, "The photographer seems to like you, you're going to be all over this album." I smiled at that, a small, careful curve of the lips that gave nothing away. The truth was, I didn't care about the album. What mattered was the undeniable fact that I was now woven into the fabric of the day in a way no one could edit out completely. The photos existed, people had seen them being taken, and whether they were included in the final curated narrative or not, the memory of that lens turning toward me would linger in the minds of those who'd witnessed it. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching the photographer with a kind of quiet gratitude. He hadn't said much, hadn't asked me anything personal, but his actions had given me something I hadn't realized I needed: a visible acknowledgement that I was here, that I mattered enough to be part of the record. And sometimes that's more powerful than any conversation could be. The morning after the wedding, I woke to the pale light of an overcast sky slipping through the blinds. My phone was still on the nightstand where I'd dropped it the night before, face down, as if I'd been avoiding whatever messages might have arrived while I was asleep. My body felt heavy in that post-event way, not from physical exertion but from the emotional weight of the night before. For a few moments, I just lay there, letting the stillness wrap around me. The wedding replayed in fragments, the walk into the venue, the glances from the last row, the way the photographer had looked at me like I wasn't just another anonymous guest. The click of the shutter in those moments still lingered in my head, crisp and deliberate. I reached for my phone more out of habit than intention, expecting little more than the usual cluster of unread notifications. But the first thing I saw was a text from someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, an old mutual friend of Emma's and mine. I saw the pictures. "You looked incredible. I think you broke the internet last night." I frowned, my pulse quickening just a little. Pictures? I opened Instagram, and there it was. The photographer had already posted a selection of images from the wedding. Not the typical first posts of just the couple or the carefully staged bouquet. These were more like a highlight reel of moments that told a story from multiple angles. And woven into that story, unmistakably, was me. The first shot was from the ceremony. Me in the last row, posture poised, expression calm, the aisle stretching out in front of me. The lighting was perfect, soft but deliberate, and the caption read something about quiet moments in the midst of celebration. Another was from the reception, the one where I was positioned near the head table, the new maid of honor visible just behind me, bouquet in hand. The framing was subtle but intentional. Anyone looking closely could see the tension threaded through it. And then there was the group shot, the one I hadn't expected him to include. I was there, standing clearly in the mix of family and bridal party, not shoved to the side but balanced in the frame like I belonged there. The comments were already stacking up beneath it, a mix of congratulations, compliments, and from people who clearly knew more than they were saying, little barbed observations. Interesting lineup. Some stories tell themselves, I scrolled, half in disbelief, half in a slow, dawning awareness of what this meant. These images weren't just proof that I'd been there. They were proof that my presence had been acknowledged, documented, and shared. In a day where I had been deliberately erased from the official narrative, here was a parallel record, one that couldn't be undone with a seating chart or a replacement title. The messages started coming in faster after that. A college friend sent a screenshot with, "Okay, you have to tell me everything. That picture says so much without saying anything." Another from someone I barely knew, "You handled yourself like a queen. Respect." Even my cousin texted, "This is going around in our group chat. We're all rooting for you." It wasn't that I wanted to be the center of attention, at least not in the way the bride had been. But there was a deep, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the truth had a way of surfacing, even without me speaking it aloud. The people who knew the backstory didn't need an explanation. The ones who didn't were curious enough to ask. And Emma, well, I could only imagine what she thought when she saw how many people had saved, shared, and commented on those photos. By mid-afternoon, I saw that a few of the images had been reposted by other guests, each with their own captions. One called me the mysterious woman in navy, another simply wrote, "Grace under pressure." The phrases varied, but the sentiment was the same. Something about my presence had resonated. I thought about the way Emma had avoided my eyes after the first photo, the stiffness in her shoulders during the group shot. She had worked so hard to write me out of the visible parts of her day, and yet here I was, threaded back into the story in a way she couldn't control. Not through confrontation, not through drama, but through stillness, composure, and the unflinching gaze into a camera lens that had refused to overlook me. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky deepened to that muted blue of early winter, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window. My phone was still buzzing occasionally with new notifications, but I let them pile up. The point had already been made. I thought back to the morning months ago when the invitation had arrived, the promise it had seemed to carry, the months of effort and small sacrifices I'd made to honor it. All of that had been taken from me without warning, but what I realized now was that the most important thing hadn't been taken at all. My dignity had stayed exactly where it belonged, with me. The photos were more than images. They were a record of that, proof that I had shown up, seen everything clearly, and refused to let someone else's choices dictate the entirety of my story. They captured not just a moment, but a truth, that sometimes the quietest presence can end up speaking the loudest. And as I sipped my tea, watching the first stars blink into view, I felt it not triumph, exactly, but something steadier. A calm certainty that the people who mattered had seen me for who I was, and that the ones who hadn't, well, their silence told its own story. The camera had done its work. Now, I didn't need to say another word.